Good evening, Archer community. It's so wonderful and so special to be able to reach out to you and to be with you in this way this evening. One of the very hardest aspects of school closure and lockdown has been the simple lack of ability for us to be together, for those simple and daily rhythms of school life, that time that we're able to enjoy together, from the informal conversations, chatting and catching up, to the more formal opportunities for learning and reflecting. This evening enables us to be a community once again in more of a live and interactive way. And I'm delighted that it looks as if almost half of our student body, supported by their parents, will take part in this occasion this evening. Since the very tragic death of George Floyd, I have never felt more acutely about the importance of school as a space and a place for discussion, for reflection, a safe place, a place where lessons such as citizenship, thematic learning and SPEC provide opportunities for young people to express their thoughts, their feelings, to talk about how they're feeling, to ask good questions of one another, but also the power and importance of opportunities such as assemblies and that space to be together and to think collectively about the issues that are facing us around the world. We have some opportunity tonight to try and bring ourselves together with the very challenging issues that we have all been experiencing. I've been delighted by the way in which staff and students have come together to form our Diversity and Inclusion Society. That work had begun just before school closure, and I'm thrilled that staff and students have brought it to the very fore and ensured, in fact, it has come to life during school closure. I very much look forward to the adventure ahead of us as a school, the journey ahead of us as a school, because we know that we can do more, we want to do more, and we want to do better. And this evening's debate and discussion provides us that platform to start and to explore and to secure some common goals and next steps. Now, this evening, in terms of technical, many of you have sent through some thought-provoking and incredible questions. But if you would like to pose a question live this evening, please may I ask you to use the Q&A function in the chat, and those questions will come through so that we can ask them to our panelists later. But the most important aspect of this evening is that the voice of our students and our staff is truly heard, and that then we can benefit from the incredible voices that are joining us from our broader communities this evening with so much insight to offer us. But now I shall hand over to those very powerful voices, the voices of Archer students and Archer staff, as they set the context for our debate this evening. Again, I'm so pleased you're here. Thank you.
Black Lives Matter means to me that in 2020 we haven't progressed since the abolishment of slavery in 1833 and the Civil Rights Act in 1964. As a country, nation and as a world, we haven't grown. Racism still exists, but is just more systemized than it was 5 decades ago. The Black Lives Matter movement is very empowering. No one is born hating another person because of the colour of their skin or their background or religion. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. This quote came from Nelson Mandela, who was the first black president of South Africa. I believe that educating people that have a closed mindset surrounding race is a step in the right direction. Educating our friends, families and communities on these current events moves us closer to equality and justice for black people.
I was born in the early 80s in Tottenham. Tottenham was a very diverse area, and in my early years I never faced any form of racism. I first faced racism when I went to go and visit my aunt and uncle and cousins when they moved out of London to Essex. Me and my cousins decided to go out on the weekend to the market. On our way to the market, there was a group of young white kids standing outside the shop, and they decided to start heckling us as we walked by. We were called lots of different names, and I didn't quite understand why I was being called these names. I came back to London and thought nothing of it. And for many years, visiting my aunt and uncle, this happened. It was only when I became, later on in my teenage years in the late 90s, I felt I was different. I spoke to my dad, and my dad explained his experiences of racism that he has faced within the army. I quickly realised that my skin colour was a problem. It was something that I never had to worry about growing up. But now it was something that I really had to think about. Wherever I went, whatever I did, and how people looked at me and perceived me. And did I feel like I wanted to be a different race? Yes, sometimes I did. But as time went on, I realised that I'm black, of mixed heritage, and I'm proud. And no one's ever going to take that proudness away from me.
It means gaining equality for all and not just for some. It means being able to achieve things that was not possible for my grandparents and the people who came before them, and also paving the way for my future grandchildren. It means hope for the future. It means building a society where people are judged on their merits and who they are as a person instead of what they look like, their skin colour and other differences. A society where diversity is not just tolerated, but actively sought after and encouraged. It's about hope. Thank you.
Black Lives Matter means acknowledging that we as black people are human, that we aren't property. It is a statement to make people realise that our lives, our contributions, our education, and our opinions all matter. It's equality. It's not being followed by security when I walk into a shop. It's not being looked at differently because of the colour of my skin. It's not having to take extra precautions when I go out with my friends because I fear that I might be treated differently. Black Lives Matter as much as everyone else's. We're not asking for special treatment.
From an early age, you are reminded that you are a black boy of this world. Be careful. You're taught to accept the hateful words yet show love. Black has been and is still being disdained. How many more generations to endure this pain? A black boy runs home every day trying to get rid of his blackness. We're told to smile more, appreciate more, be thankful more. But behind the mask, we cry more. We cry, we cry, we cry, until we are no more. A black boy walking on the street, smiling, trying to make connections with everyone he meets is seen as danger. A black boy who talks eloquently is frowned upon because he doesn't fit their agenda. A black boy who's trying to have a mark on this world is booed at to go back to the zoo. A black boy who's always stood for change is labelled as a problem child. A black boy who has said one day he wishes to be the next leader of this country is laughed at and told you're better off dreaming it. We cry. We cry for change. We cry to be heard. We cry not for revenge, but for that longing change. Black. Behind the cries and masks is a human who's carrying the burden of the past, longing to be seen, longing to be heard. Black is beautiful. Black is my colour. The black boy is Mr. Carter.
I have no doubt, Archer community, that those videos have had the same impact on you as they have had on me. Those are our students, our members of staff who have been so brave to share their thoughts, their feelings and their personal experiences. I can't imagine the preparation that took. But those messages of hope, those messages of overcoming that adversity, those messages of us being able to do more to change that come through loudly and strongly for me. I hope that they do for you as well. It is now my great privilege to hand over to our wonderful Mr. Carter, who is going to lead us in a very special discussion with the Right Honourable David Lammy. It is our great privilege to welcome the Right Honourable David Lammy to be with us this evening. I know that your schedule must be beyond hectic, but we look forward to hearing your thoughts, your words, and the influence that they can have for our young people. So, Mr. Carter, David Lammy, it's over to you.
Thank you, Miss Harrison. David Lammy, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. The whole community is humbled as we know this is an incredibly busy and important time. Watching those videos, if you were part of the Archer community and I posed the question to you, what does Black Lives Matter mean to you?
Well, Look, I mean, I'm very pleased to join you this afternoon. I mean, obviously watching those videos for me are impactful because you can't not be moved by those stories and those tales. They're not new though. You know, I need to say that categorically. They aren't new. Let me just be clear. It's important to understand that Black people have been talking about the reality of structural racism in our world, in our country, for years and years and years. We've made fantastic comedy about it, from Eddie Murphy to Dave Chappelle to Lenny Henry to Chris Rock. We've written amazing books about it, from Maya Angelou to Toni Morrison to James Baldwin. We've sung about it, and I'm not going to list the artists because the list is endless. And the vast majority of modern music, in a sense, derives from that soul that comes from the Black community. And what's extraordinary is despite all of that, over all of my lifetime, and I'm now almost 50, the truth is that this moment feels like potentially the first moment in which majority communities in our own country, certainly, and in the rest of the world, and I'm talking about largely white communities, are finally prepared to listen. And so we've got to ask ourselves, despite all that has been written, has been sung, has been said, has been joked about to get this message across, films that have been made, why now? And it may have something to do with the coronavirus. People have been at home, they've paused, they pressed the pause button on their lives. And so perhaps the murder of George Floyd cut through in this powerful way. It may have something to do with Donald Trump and his leadership of the United States. And it may just be something to do with the millennial generation, of which, Mark, you, I think, are included, and Generation Y, and their refusal, this is Black and white, to accept what their parents and grandparents have accepted. And that is that, of course, racism is wrong, but the news cycle moves on and we go back to our old way. Because you see, structural racism, which is what this is really about, is really challenging the system. It's also important to say that in our own country, where Black people make up just 3% of the population, I know it feels like a lot more here in London, but it is actually just 3% of the national population. In order to combat racism, this is not just a discussion of Blackness. It is a discussion of whiteness. And that's really important to settle on. It's a discussion of, and it's forcing, you see, you and I, Mark, we're conscious of our race every day of the week, every minute of the day, every time we step out of home, every time we navigate the workplace, we're conscious of our race because the system forces that. And it certainly forces that if you're a minority, it forces that upon you. There may be some who have a different sexuality on this. They will also be forced to think about that sexuality on a regular basis. And there may be women who are also participating, who understand that business of being forced to think about their gender. But you see, I think there are so many white people, and let's be clear, I'm married to a wonderful white woman. Half of my family are white. So I say this with no ill at all. It's through knowledge. They aren't thinking about their whiteness on a daily basis. They aren't forced to, encouraged to. They're thinking about being Jack or Jill or Tom or Freddie. And therefore you're allowed to pretend that you are colorblind. when people raise things like white privilege, it's kind of to say what a privilege it is for you not to have to think about race in the way that you and I have to think about race on a regular basis. So when I say that this moment is not, in my belief, really about blackness, it's about whiteness. It's about really thinking about why, despite all that I've said that the black community have done, this has not really been listened to. And as a politician, I need to tell you that it's in part about power. It's in part about indifference. It's in part about a lack of empathy. And when I say power, power means that you have to do something to share that power and to break down those barriers. Being an ally is a verb. It means doing. It's not just listening or hearing. It means acting. Challenging racism when you see it and hear it, going that extra mile when you're recruiting, and you know, understanding that you've got to have, when people apply, a shortlist that includes black and ethnic minority people. It's going the extra mile to make things happen, to change the pen, to bend it towards justice and social justice and equality. So that's what this moment offers us. Yeah. The question is, will people grab hold of it?
Yeah, and I really do hope there is change. And you spoke briefly about your family background there. So you've written and spoken about the racism and humiliation you endured as a young boy. What do you think has changed for the positive when it comes to racial equality and understanding this in the UK?
Well, on a positive note, I think since I was younger, I think that we have a generation in our country, millennials on the whole and Generation Y, younger people who really get this stuff. By the way, they don't just get race, they get climate change and a whole host of other issues. That's positive. I think that overt acts of racism, the sort of signs that my parents were faced with when they arrived in this country from the Caribbean. My dad in 1956, you know, no Irish, no dogs, no blacks. I think those overt acts have changed. But unfortunately, many of the overt acts of discrimination have become covert acts, haven't they? And unfortunately, racism has a way of reinventing itself. Just when you think you've got past it, it reinvents, particularly actually when we're in economically tough times, and we have been in economically tough times, and it's very likely we're heading into more economically tough times where it's sort of easy to blame people that look different to you for all the problems of the world. So I think it's improved a bit. We see more black people in public life like me than we have before. You know, on television when I was growing up, you know, there were shows like Till Death Us Do Part, Alf Garnett, often black people with a butt of humor. There's far less of that now in popular culture. But unfortunately, I'm not, you know, I think that what we're hearing in Black Lives Matter is it's not all about those overt acts or those individual acts of racism, because we know that the big issues are about structural racism, institutions like, unfortunately, the police, you know, our criminal justice system, even our education system, where people are asking for a much better understanding of Britain's colonial past taught in our schools. Those are the issues that matter. And unfortunately, those issues have not really moved a dial.
Okay. Speaking of actually in terms of systems and institutionalized issues, in the past few weeks, students and staff have been having heated debates in relation to the Edward Colston and Cecil Rhodes statues. I know you have condemned people for the defacement of Winston Churchill because it's deflected away from the Black Lives Movement. What are your thoughts in relation to the statues, and do you think we should have open discussions about it?
Well, look, I am a seasoned politician, and I think it's important to pick your battles wisely. Let's go back a bit. Back in 2007, the then Prime Minister Tony Blair asked me to become Culture Minister for the UK and to help the country commemorate the abolition of the slave trade in 1807. And so I did lots of work with the BBC, with our museums, in our cultural life to help us commemorate that important milestone. And I worked with different cities, London, of course, Liverpool, which has a strong relationship with the slavery period as a sort of port city, Cardiff, Hull, which is the home of William Wilberforce, who was one of the major abolitionists, and of course Bristol. And the city that struggled the most was Bristol. The events they had didn't feel as deep. There were vast sections of the community in Bristol sort of left out of the celebrations, and they had a vexed history in talking about people like Colston. And what we're seeing is the failure to act way back in 2007, ricocheting now 13 years later. And so I'm not surprised that there was a desire to bring that statue down. I prefer it was done in a democratic way, but I understand why it's happened. And I hope this provokes a debate, because when we put monuments up like that, it's about who we celebrate, who we call icons. And I think that those sorts of things are better dealt with in museums, where there's context and where that debate can be had about the importance of individuals. But when we celebrate someone, we should celebrate, and in Bristol, I would celebrate someone like Paul Stevenson, who led the fight for Black people in that city to be properly employed and recognised in the bus service way back in the 60s, and led the Bristol boycott in that city. Someone like him, a Black man, a pioneer in terms of civil rights in our country, should be on a statue, not Mr. Colston.
All right, that's an interesting outtake, because one of the students, when we had this debate, and I quote, has stated the following: statues are extreme forms of dedication. It's a problem if this debate here is that of statues or just a form of education. Hard to question the morality in that sense. Statues are flawed and they only validate egos. What would you say to that student who said this in our recent meeting?
I think it's an interesting point, but in my experience, most communities in the world deify and celebrate particular individuals, right or wrong. Every now and then there has to be a recalibration of the truth of that. In fact, most human beings are flawed, but some are flawed more than others. But you've got to ask, why would we celebrate any individual who had killed over 19,000 Africans, many of them drowned overseas? Why would that be something that we celebrate? And why is it that in Britain, we would never celebrate a Holocaust denier, someone who had killed Jews, or indeed Blacks or gay men and women during the Second World War? Why is it okay to celebrate someone who's taken Black life? That's the question. Why is that okay? And what does that tell you about the society in which you're living in? What does that denial to call that out for what it is tell you? That's the question. That's the nub of the question. And I'm afraid we've got to challenge quite hard about Britain's refusal, really, to get into that. Yeah. And to fess up to that.
So in terms of, as a shadow minister, how will you use this accelerated moment to progress change and to have an impact on the country?
Well, my principal body of work is contained in the review that I did for David Cameron on the criminal justice system. And that was where I looked at the issues of Black and ethnic minorities disproportionately present in our criminal justice system. I'll just give you one statistic. the ethnic minority population of Britain is around about 14%. It rises to about 19% if we look at just young people in Britain. The population of ethnic minorities and black young men particularly in our criminal justice system, in our youth offenders institutions, so that's under 18, is 51%. That's an extraordinary number, 51%. It was 41% when I did this review for David Cameron and reported 3 years ago. It's risen by 10% in 3 years. That ought to be a national emergency, but it's not. If Black Lives Matter, we've got to do something about that. No. And so criminal justice is the thing that I'm obviously most focused on as Shadow Justice Secretary.
Okay. We've got a lot of young people watching today, Mr. Lammy. How can they engage using their domain of influence to act now and be allies? What advice would you say to our young people?
Well, I would say we've got a job to do to challenge generations above you, baby boomers, my generation, Gen Xers. We've got to demand change. That does mean challenging your parents, making it clear to them that racism is not acceptable and structural racism exists. Your wider family. It means forcing debates, particularly where you're in all white settings, and not being afraid of it. It means thank you for joining those marches, although as a member of parliament, I've got to tell you, they've got to be socially distanced within the rules. Yeah. It means lobbying your member of parliament. It means joining organizations that campaign for these issues, including Black Lives Matter and others, many exist. It means reading. Fantastic books being written at the moment by people like Reni Eddo-Lodge. My book, Tribes, discusses racism. Afia Hirsch, Akala, a whole range of people. So educate yourself, be informed, and recognize that change does not come in a day or a week, a month or a year. It does take time, and it takes sustained effort. And let me just tell you this really, really clearly. Just like the Me Too moment a couple of years ago that began to address issues of the treatment of women at the hands of men in wider society, the news cycle will move on, the marching will stop, and another issue will be amongst us. And that's the test. Do we still care about Black Lives Matter when the news cycle has moved on? Is it still central to the life of your school, your family, your friendship group? Is it still something we're battling, or was it just a passing fad and we went back to business as usual? That's the issue, and that's the challenge, I think, to those who are listening and participating.
Well, Mr. Lammy, thank you so much for your time. We're super grateful. I know you're heading off to somewhere else now, but thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Keep doing all that you're doing. And I've met pupils from the school over the years. I know it's a fantastic part of our family of schools in North London. So all power to you.
I'm going to ask each of the panelists to reflect for a couple of minutes on the provocations that I'm playing in, mainly because often at these events you want to have as much time as you can for the Q&As that have come in advance. We've got lots of those, so we're going to make sure there's plenty of time for that. So I'm going to start by introducing Dr. Carleen Furman, MBE, to turn on a camera. Brilliant, there you are. Hi, Carleen. And she's a British social researcher and writer specialising in violence between young people and the founder of Misunderstood Partnership. She's a senior research fellow at the University of Bedfordshire, where she leads in their contextual safeguarding and peer-on-peer abuse programmes. And it's so amazing to see a black female academic leading this work and leading this arena. And I want to start by asking you about a really important issue that lots of people have asked us, which is about liberating the curriculum. And why do you think diversifying and liberating the curriculum is important? And what do you think the impacts are for young people as a result of that.
Thanks so much for that question, Ben. And before I answer it, I do just want to say I have a 3-year-old playing with a train track right at my feet. So if there is kind of too much noise, I really do apologise. I'm going to hold this mic quite closely to try to make sure that I'm the main person that you hear. Ziora, darling, please, not too loud, okay? So around the curriculum, I think this is a really important question because a few years ago, I visited New Zealand and Australia as part of a Winston Churchill fellowship to look at responses to gender-based violence in different countries. And I was really stunned by the conversations I had with young people in New Zealand because of the level of knowledge they had about the history of New Zealand, the particularly Maori culture, legacy, land, and so on and so forth, and therefore the history of colonization and empire. And they knew a lot more about the history, in many respects, the international history of the UK than a lot of UK young people that were friends of mine when I was growing up or that I've met now. And a lot of that is down to their curriculum. You know, it is part of the core curriculum to understand the difficult history of the country as well as the things that are to be celebrated. And I think because that happens, you then see that conversation enshrined in other parts of the way they operate the country. So a lot of locations are named in original Maori script. When you fly with Air New Zealand, you're greeted in Maori, not in English. There's a lot of Maori symbolism on logos and signs of kind of national corporate organizations there. It starts with the curriculum, but it bleeds out into the kind of the education that you just get by moving around a space. And I think in the UK we have the opposite of both of those. So we don't have accurate history of colonization. If we just think about how Christopher Columbus is taught, for example, in schools, it's a complete one-sided tale of discovery that would be unrecognizable to First Nations people in the countries that Christopher Columbus invaded, but also that then plays out in our public spaces where we get the same narrative, which has an absence of colonization and the violence and brutality that went with colonization. I think that's the real difficulty, is that even when we say, oh, that country was discovered or that country was discovered, we don't think about the plight of the people that were living there to begin with and what they endured as part of that process. We then struggle to understand our place. You know, I think when I met with young people in New Zealand, whether they were white New Zealanders or Maori young people, they recognized their place, and they all had a place, and they all had a sense of belonging. And that sense of belonging is often absent in places where your history doesn't make sense, where you can't understand how we've ended up where we are. There's then a sense of, I don't belong here because I can't work out my road. There's no chronology. And we need a more accurate chronology of how we've ended up all in this place together, but also how we've ended up in other parts of the world. I mean, just basic things like understanding why so many countries speak English. I mean, I don't think a lot of people, unless they take the time, understand the process of why a lot of people speak English. I've had people say to me, oh, it's just because that's just the language everyone speaks, or that's because everyone likes the language. I mean, there's just no connection between that and colonization. So our curriculum has a lot to do, not just in history, but in linguistics, in every part of the way that we're educated needs to consider the extent to which the truth of our history and the truth of who we are colours that content.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to bring in our second panellist here, Miss Ogbagsalesi, and building on Colleen's comments, it'd be really interesting to hear your reflections on liberating the curriculum. You're the head of Year 7, you're a teacher of history, you studied an MA and Birkbeck in European history, and a deep commitment to ensuring educational environment is inclusive and nurturing space for all backgrounds. And it'd be really interesting to reflect on someone who studied history and now someone who's teaching it. Do you think that we have progressed on the issue of liberating the curriculum, or and where do you think that needs to go in the future?
I think to a degree we have. I think if I think back to my own experiences of being a history student in secondary school, I was very much told what was the correct answer, so to speak. And I often speak to my students about this, and I will say, so I'm not necessarily here to tell you what's right or wrong, but we're looking at the quality of your argument and the skill set that you would develop in a history classroom, you know, critical thinking, debate, analysis, being able to sustain an argument. Those are the skills that I think are absolutely crucial in any history classroom. But I think coming back to this idea of liberating the curriculum and the reasons why that is so important, if we think about society today, it is incredibly diverse, it is incredibly multicultural, and we need to ensure that the content that students are given is equally diverse and rich and 3D, so to speak, and that there's a sense of it being multi-layered. And I think that ultimately, if you think about the curriculum in itself, it's not about rewriting the curriculum, but it's about having a sense of transparency, which is what Carleen was saying. It's also about greater visibility and ensuring that content is taught in a way that is all-encompassing. And if we think about the benefits that that could have for young people today, those of ethnic minorities, of course, they'd feel represented, heard, empowered, but also students that aren't of ethnic minority backgrounds, and they being able to understand the society in which they're growing up and navigating themselves as well.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And then our final panelist member is Ashley Hickson Lovelace, who's the Archer Academy's English patron. He's a poet and a novelist from Hackney, previously a secondary school teacher, and is currently completing his PhD. I don't envy you for that, that was pretty hard going, in creative and critical writing at the University of East Anglia. And your debut novel has been enjoyed by many Archer students who have been commenting on it. And I wanted to take the lens that I remember when I was back at school, actually, that I never read an author who looked like me or reflected my culture or the things that were going on around my dining room table. And often we talk about liberating the curriculum through the lens of history, and I wonder what you think the importance of liberating and diversifying the curriculum is, but particularly from a lens of literature and diversity of perspectives and authors.
Absolutely, yeah. I think, well, I want to start by saying that the head teacher, Lucy Harrison, spoke about this being a journey, and I think it's such a huge thing that this conversation is happening, and this is part of the journey, so I think that's worth acknowledging. And David Lammy talked about how this is such an integral and important time, and there's no doubting that this is, you know, what with the emergence and the rise of just outrage of what's happening in society. This is such an important conversation. I feel honoured to be part of it. From an English lens, yes, I feel that the curriculum has been guilty of sort of tokenism in the past. So let's take the English GCSE curriculum, where there's 1 or 2 poems that are on the GCSE syllabus from people of colour, and even those are slightly problematic. And I feel there isn't sort of that wider, proportionate, consistent representation of BAME voices. And what I mean by that is when we think about sort of huge words like the literary canon, and there is just a real lack of figures who sound like or look like a lot of the students that we teach, especially in a London context. So that's hugely concerning for me. If you know, I'm not a history teacher, I'm an English teacher, but history seems to be confined on the surface of it to just 1 month for Black History Month. And I feel like it just needs to be consistent and proportionate throughout the whole year, because what's happening at the moment, which is really concerning for me, is the fact that our voices are seemingly only heard when there's outrage or when there's a need to protest, like the murder of George Floyd and the stop and search, unfair stop and search legislation that's in place, seemingly, especially this summer. Whereas we need to have that sort of incessant positivity, that incessant platform of arts and literature and history and dance, whatever it is, throughout the course of a student's school life. It needs to be, our voices are, we're not angry people, you know, it needs to be consistent. And so that's something that I feel really passionate about.
Fundamentally about, Colleen, the school's role, and what do you think a role is for school that's based at the heart of a community that feels that it has a wider responsibility than just teaching children in the classroom? You know, we are proud of our connection with the community. What do you think a role for a school like this is on the issue of race and equality and inclusion?
Well, I think, I mean, just by having this event tonight, you're demonstrating kind of what the power of what you can do, and being able to bring together so many people for a conversation, to kind of share ideas, to work together is an amazing achievement. And I think one of the things that schools have access to that a lot of other kind of institutions or services don't are young people and parents, and being physically part of a geographical community. All of those things intertwined are quite unique. When we do work with schools, it's one of the few places where we get access to parents and engagement with parents on views, as well as young people, but also engagement with young people, not because they're subject to a referral because there's an issue, but just because it's general engagement. And that really shouldn't be underestimated, the power of that if you can build ways to engage young people in these conversations and in these actions in a universal setting, that has significant reach beyond those that only kind of target specific groups of young people at specific times in specific settings. I also think, obviously, as you're thinking already, is moving beyond your curriculum. So you want to take that out of your mouth? Moving beyond your curriculum to everything that you practice in your policies, in your procedures, in your extracurricular activities, in any kind of clubs or societies, things that you initiate, thinking about all of those things and the extent to which they enable and advance this movement, I think is extremely important. And I think never assuming that you've nailed it in that process, always questioning yourselves. I think particularly if you identify as being quite progressive, quite forward thinking, quite proactive, I think that actually is job done. And continuing to review that and engaging young people and parents as part of that is going to be really important.
Thank you. And Miss, can I ask what role do you think students and staff and parents have of keeping momentum of this issue kind of moving forward in the school?
I think in terms of the role that staff have, it's I think as a head of year, if I think about the responsibility that I hold, I think it's also, you know, modeling the conversations that are very difficult to have. It's not easy to sit and have a conversation about race. It's something that I struggle with as, you know, as an adult who's kind of you know, had to have these conversations and moments over many years. And I think that the role that staff have there is okay, well, how can we take this as a difficult conversation, but ensure that the conversation is still had, it's still meaningful, it's still far reaching, and it continues over time. And it's I suppose modeling that for students in a way, so not so that they can say this and can't say that, absolutely not, but it's about how do you take something that's difficult and break it down so that you can reflect, have a moment to listen and move forward, and think carefully about how you are going to move forward as a community collective. I think in terms of parents, I mean, I'm not a parent, but I imagine that as, you know, for parents, it's quite hard to feel as though you don't know the answer if your child is asking you something. But I think if we come back to what was said earlier on, it is very much about a journey. And, you know, I myself won't have all the answers, but as long as you are willing to reflect and to learn and to engage and to listen, more than anything, I think that, you know, that journey is something that needs to be continued, and it's not one that one goes on alone, but I think as a community group, whether that is a family, whether that is a school, it's definitely about moving that journey forward and thinking about where you go to next.
I was lucky to come and visit Archer for the very first time last November, and I saw firsthand sort of the rich texture of the demographic of the students and the cohort, We have obviously students from around the corner in Bishop's Avenue, but we also have students from Archway, which is where I went to school. So we have such a diverse cohort, which I think is such a brilliant I wouldn't say starting point, because I really think Archer are really well along that journey that we have all been talking about. But it's a very privileged position to be in relation to location, because we have the vast spectrum of class and privilege. So that's a really good point to make. I feel that I'm just going to echo essentially that this is a journey, and I feel like, as you said, there is so many invested stakeholders involved. We have the students themselves who have produced wonderful pieces of artwork already and music already and bits of literature. When I went, we did a poetry workshop, and we had kids talking about PS4s, we had kids talking about ponies, for instance. That was brilliant. But we also have impressive governors, and all of this really shows that Archer are on an incredible sort of journey. I'm going to say it again. I love the analogy of a journey. I'm going to keep saying it, to sort of striving for equality. I also feel like the students clearly recognize that, education is not just about the grades on the paper necessarily. It's about being a well-rounded person. It's about being a person who's in tune politically. And I feel like definitely in my experience, that is the case. So yeah, all good so far. But like we talked about, and like Carleen said, which I thought really emanated, was the fact that there is no end to this imminently. This has to keep going. And yeah, so this is only the start of it.
Thank you to my Archer students and my Archer staff there in terms of shaping where we go next, building on this first important step this evening. For me, it's about ensuring that yes, we are talking, and yes, we are listening, but that also we are making structural changes around how we run our school, how we lead our school, how student focused and student led that school is, about where we can take control of our own curriculum and the diversity of it we do, but we also think about the broader implications of that as well. But if we go back for a moment to think about what David Lammy's advice was to each of us and to our students in particular, he highlighted clearly that it was our job, everybody's job, to stand up and to act and to think and to talk, but also to listen to the issues and experiences in our broader society, that we must challenge those above us. I have a role to play there. Students, you have a role. Staff, you have a role. Parents, you have a role. That we do demand that change, even when it's uncomfortable and hard to ask it. From the conversations that I know I will be having with exam boards to central politicians, but what conversations will you be having and leading on? That we force those debates around our whiteness and what that might mean for some of us, but also around the whiteness of broader society and our curriculum, and that we campaign. We choose how and when to do that. We ensure that it's in a place where we will be safe and where the voices will be heard, but that we look carefully to doing that well together. As an Archer community, we are proud to be the diverse community that we are. We are proud to be the inclusive community that we are. But we're also proud to say that we can do more, we can do better, we can do differently, but that we can only do that all together. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us this evening on this first step in that journey to doing more, better and differently. And I very much look forward to where we will go next. I hope that we may be able to have an opportunity like this again later in the autumn, where perhaps we can put some pressure on ourselves to talk about what we've already managed to achieve in that period of time, to ensure that we are driving momentum, not just waiting for other people to drive it for us. I would like once again to thank the wonderful speakers who have joined us this evening and shared their powerful voices. I'm delighted that Ashley will of course become a member of the Archer Academy from September, and I do very much hope that Carleen and David will join us again at another time. To my Archer staff, thank you so much for everything that you have done in starting our work, but also being here and representing all members of staff this evening. We're going to finish this evening with the most beautiful poem. This poem will be familiar to many of you, written by Maya Angelou recently, very much focused on at school through one of our thoughts for the week. But Maya's poem this evening will certainly leave us with plenty to now think and reflect upon, always such an important thing to do after such a rich debate as this evening. So I'm going to leave you now this evening with my great thanks and gratitude for everything you've afforded us this evening, and my real sense of hope for where we will go next as a school community. I look forward to that journey together. Thank you and best wishes.
You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust I'll rise.
Does my sassiness upset you?
Why are you beset of gloom?
Because I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room.
Just like moons and like suns, with the certainty of tides, just like hope springing high, still I'll rise.
Did you want to see me broken? Bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries.
Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard, 'cause I laugh like I've got gold mines digging in my own backyard.
You might shoot me with your words, you might cut me with your eyes, you might kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise.
Does my sexiness upset you? Does it come as a surprise? That I dance like I've got diamonds at the meeting of my thighs.
Out of the huts of history's shame, I rise. Up from the past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide.
Leaving behind the nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise.
Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the dream and hope of the slave. I rise. I rise.
I rise, I rise.